It's finally time for the NBA to embark upon a drastic overhaul. I'm talking about getting rid of conferences altogether. Bye-bye advantage Eastern Conference teams. Let's talk about that because right now there is a serious push in the NBA to get rid of the conference system. I'm Trevor Lane. This is the Basketball Bulletin. Hit that subscribe button so you stay up to date on all the latest around the league. Joining me is Donnie Freeman. Donnie, I know we're West Coast guys, but I'm going to try to be as unbiased as possible when looking at getting rid of NBA conferences.
Yeah, definitely. I know that, half the league is pretty happy with how things go for them year round. So that's another thing to consider here. But, I feel like the competitive balance is kind of off a little bit, and we're going to talk about that today. But yeah, I like you said, we're going to try to not be so biased, but I kind of would like this.
Same. Here's what Zach Lowe said the other day. Zach Lowe said, envy and bitterness from Western execs and coaches regarding the state of the East is at an all-time high due to the Sixers and Bucks struggles, not totally burying them. Yeah, think about that. The Sixers, if the Sixers and Bucks were in the East, or in the West, they're just about done right now. Like, especially the Sixers at 2-11, something like that.
12.
Oh my gosh, they'd be done. They're out. It's game over already. But in the East, it's so forgiving. Take a look. The East, it's so forgiving. Yeah, 2-12, but you can bounce back because look at this. Now, it's better than it was a couple weeks ago. It's gotten better. You've got 4 teams now above 500 in the East, so there's something there. But I mean, you are what? You are 2-12, and you're 3.5 games back of a play-in spot. Yeah. If you're the 76ers. That's crazy in the Eastern Conference. Then meanwhile, you go and you look at the West, and you've got teams that are above 500 right now that don't even make the play-in in the West. Look at the Spurs are a 500 ball club, and they're 2 spots out of the play-in in the Western Conference. Donnie, if this was a one-year thing, if this was a blip on the radar, it's not normally like this, that'd be one thing. It's been 2 decades. More than 2 decades. Since the early 2000s, the West has been stronger than the East. I think there's been maybe 2 seasons total that the East has actually put up a better winning percentage overall than the West. Other than that, every single year, it's been a disadvantage to be in the West and an advantage to be in the Eastern Conference. Is it time to finally fix this?
Yeah, I was going to say, I know that there was a couple of times where the East performed really well relative to the West, but it's, as you said, twice in 20-something years is extremely bad. And typically with the East, there are just a few teams that are extremely good, and then the rest of the teams aren't really all that great. And like you said, with the bottom guys like the Sixers, the fact you can still say they can rebound from this is crazy because if they were in the West, they probably aren't going to rebound unless they go on some hellacious run. And so I think that, it probably is time to fix it because what happens is, and why they can rebound and why the East is kind of the way it is because you have 3, 4, 5 teams at least that are just bad. They're just really, really bad teams. And then you have all the teams in the East playing these guys 3, 4 times a year. So you're banking free wins. And so that's why the Sixers should be able, if things, go right, should be able to rebound, but also why the East just kind of is how it is. It's despicable to me. And this is not a slight to the Hawks, but it's despicable to me to see them have a playoff spot 2 games below 500. That's kind of crazy.
Yeah,
so
not even playoffs.
Exactly, a playoff spot. I think this will obviously normalize. I think that 6 seed cutoff line will probably be a 500 team, which is nothing crazy either. But just being below 500 right now is kind of crazy.
It really is, and this is just it's the reality of the Eastern Conference. But like you said, I've got people that tell me, "Oh, but the Celtics won last year, so clearly the East is better than the West." No, we're talking about what 2 teams right now at the top of the East that are really playing well, and that's the Cavs and the Celtics, and that's it. That's it. Like everybody else, at best, they're playing okay. They're playing solid basketball, but it's not like they're world beaters or anything. So yes, you've got a couple of really good teams, but guess what? Those couple of really good teams also get more. I don't want to say nights off, but more games over the course of the season where they don't really have to push down on the gas pedal in order to get a win because you've got all these teams, this glut of teams in the Eastern Conference that are just not all that great. But Western teams are banding together to potentially talk about this. Is becoming a bigger and bigger talking point. Here, this is from Brian Windhorst of ESPN. They're going to see what they can do here. West coaches and executives grow exasperated looking at what records might qualify for the postseason in the East. They're floating a concept saying, as we're moving towards expansion 2 to 3 years from now, since we're going to have to redraw things then anyway, you're going to have to take one team. If you let's say you add 2 teams right now, the heavy favorites to join the NBA, Las Vegas and Seattle. Welcome back, Sonics. That's right now the thought. You add 2 teams to the West, you have to move one team, just one team, everybody do the math, from the West to the Eastern Conference. The thought from West teams is, why not seize this opportunity when we're going to be changing things up anyway to completely do away with conferences? Drop the conference system altogether. You can still have the play-in, and when the play-in is finished, you seed 1 through 16. Donnie, the reason why they haven't done it in the past is travel. Is that enough reason to not do it now?
I mean, sure, it's always going to be a concern, but I think if you wanted to do that, maybe you alleviate that by providing another day off in between these games. And yeah, that would push things further out than they're typically used to with their timeline. But I think that could be one of the things they try to consider here, because I mean, otherwise, this is going to be crazy matchup madness here. You're going to have Western teams flying to East, just depending on how things, break down in the seating. And there's not really much of a way to fix it here. It doesn't matter what plane they get in or whatever it is. It doesn't really matter. So the only other alternative I can personally see is trying to just make the playoffs take longer as a whole, which you could argue maybe isn't something they're interested in or a thing that they should do.
And I think this is so true. It would be the right thing to do for the health of the league. A West general manager says it's not just about fairness. It's about giving the fans the best playoff product. Yeah, they're right. I mean, look, no disrespect to the Indiana Pacers, but they should not have been in a conference final. That's not a conference final team. They shouldn't have made it to the now there were a lot of injuries in the East last year, but the best teams are not getting through because the best teams are all in one conference. You've got, or too many good teams are in one conference. And so if the NBA is going to put this big spotlight on the playoffs and say, this is the best of the best, come watch high level basketball, then you can't have this. You can't have the Brooklyn Nets, who are outright tanking. They're going to be a seller at the trade deadline, if not before, as a play-in team. You just can't have that and expect to have a high viewership for your playoffs. But Donnie, I think this is where the ultimate problem lies. And we'll take a look at the map too in a minute to maybe redraw some things here. But here's the issue. This is the problem. As Tim Bontemps noted, in order to get this change, 23 teams have to vote for it. All the East teams are going to vote no.
Yeah.
Because they don't want to lose their advantage of being in a weak conference. They're all going to vote no. And normally I would just say, well, this is cyclical. It's going to come back around the East. But it's been so long. That's not the case. These teams have enjoyed not having to play good basketball and still make the playoffs and still get playoff revenue and all that sort of stuff. This, to me, the NBA needs to step in and fix this. The NBA needs to say, I know it takes whatever votes, but I think that Western Conference's exec he's biased, of course, but completely correct. And the NBA needs to figure out a way to say, look, I know we need 23 teams to agree. Obviously, 15 of you are going to say no matter what, because you don't want to lose this advantage, but this is not what's best for the league. We want the best teams to get through, not teams to fall backwards into the postseason because you're in a weak conference.
Yeah, absolutely. And one of the things that kind of happens is with the East too is, like, for example, the Celtics, they're putting in the work in the regular season, which does matter, but they're going to, by way of that, pretty much cruise until the conference finals, as we saw last year. And then you maybe turn it on a bit, but then you get to the finals, and that's when you really have to turn it on. And this is not to say anything about the championship. I think they deserved it. They were awesome. But then the Western Conference, it's a bloodbath the entire way through the playoffs. Every round is difficult. You're fighting for your life the entire way through, and then you may make it through the playoffs beaten and battered and maybe missing a player or two, and then ultimately that winds up being a problem. All in all, like, I think that if this, like, it's more about the bottom half of the Eastern Conference. It's not so much about the
sure.
But all in all, I think that, like, in terms of like the playoffs specifically, if it was more of a problem, I think that these numbers wouldn't be so normalized. But I did look it up, and the East, the East
You're just used to calling them that.
the East is winning 41-37 in NBA titles. So it felt like the West had been winning more recently, but that's probably also just because, the Warriors and stuff like that kind of went on that stretch there. But, it's not like it's a huge lopsided difference, despite the fact that for the last 20 years, give or take 20 years, the West has been on average stronger. So that's one thing I would consider too, is I would have thought that would have been a problem, but it's not so much. So I'm not really sure. I don't know that these teams will vote for this to happen, because I don't see any reason for them to do that unless they truly care about the competitive balance of the league. But I don't really think it's going to happen. I think it more also, if we want this to even out, I think that more players and stuff have to start shifting more towards East teams. It feels like there's not a lot of like crazy big name stars over there. It feels like they're all in the West. And oftentimes they've got 2 stars in some of these teams and stuff like that. So that's kind of what's creating all of this. And I don't know, it just feels like the East is more like, guys that are trying to, that have, been on that team for a while, and more homegrown stuff. And the West seems like it has more movement. So I'm not sure.
It's part of the reason why, and I've talked about this recently on the front office show. The West teams that are in the tanking category, they have an easier time tanking. They get pushed to the bottom because they're getting just beat up on by all of these strong West teams night in, night out. And so then what happens is the West teams wind up with the higher draft picks. The few West teams that are bad get higher draft picks because they're getting just hammered every single night. And then they get the top. That looked like it was devastating that Victor Wembanyama wound up in the Western Conference. Because that just perpetuates this whole thing of all the guys being in the West. Now, Paul George obviously went West to East, but most guys wind up going the other way. If they're in the East, they wind up coming West. And part of that, it makes me wonder, Donnie, if some of it is just, geographical advantages.
Yes.
Sure, there's Miami, there's Orlando that enjoy good weather, but I mean, the NBA is a winter sport. How many guys want to be in Boston and Philly and Detroit and Toronto and a West team, but Minnesota, but Milwaukee, Chicago, when the Suns, a cold day is mid-50s in Phoenix. You know what I mean? Like, it's a different world that you're living in. The Suns, the Lakers, the Clippers, even the Warriors, the Kings up in Northern California. You've got more warmer weather cities compared to what you see in the East. I do wonder, and there's no getting around that. There's no changing that obviously. So I wonder how much of a factor that is too, when we consider that this is a winter sport and there's going to be certain advantages that are going to lie out West compared to the Northeast teams.
Yeah, I think that is absolutely what it is. I'm a California boy, and you couldn't pay me to move to the East. You just couldn't. Also, there's a lot of natural disasters over there too, and I'm just,
there's earthquakes in California.
There's earthquakes, yeah, but where I'm at, I don't get them very often, thankfully. And so I feel like I'd rather take my chances and not have like a tornado or something come my way.
Yeah.
That's just me though. But I think that's probably a big part of what it is the weather. A lot of these guys would rather be in more fair weather places than, being negative degrees or something like that, wherever some of these other spots are. So that's probably a good bit of it too.
So we'll see if the NBA can fix this. I don't expect that the disparity is going to remain this pronounced. Like, I think, at least I hope, fingers crossed, that by the time the playoffs roll around, at least the top 6 East teams are 500 and up teams. If not, that's just going to lead to more cries for changing this. But at least that. But man, it's a real killer if you have to rely upon 23. Like, what teams in the East are going to vote to do away with conferences? And they may cite travel, they may cite other things as reasons why, but we all know why. They don't want to give up an easy path to playoff revenue. Like, they don't want to give up that. So that's going to be a challenge for the NBA. But I think at this point, we're 20 plus years in to the West, to having a significant disadvantage to being a Western Conference team versus an Eastern Conference team. And I think it's finally time. It's time for a change.
Yeah, I completely agree with you. Here's a little fun nugget I found when I was searching up the records. And this is adjacent to our topic. Apparently, in the last 39 years. This is from 7 years ago. I don't imagine it's changed much, but this post is from 7 years ago. And they said in the last 39 years, all NBA champions from the West have been from either California or Texas. So it's not only just being from the West, you probably have to also be in a certain spot in the West too.
that does help. Certain teams are going to wind up getting the players, and obviously that could lead us into a bigger, a big market versus small market thing and all that. But right now, East versus West, it's good to hear that at least it's something that's being really talked about around the league, and hopefully it's something that that ultimately leads to change. But everybody, let us know your thoughts in the comments down below. What do you think about the East-West disparity? Is it finally time that the NBA steps in and does something about it by eliminating conferences altogether so that truly the best teams make it through? Give us your thoughts in the comments section. Don't forget to subscribe and go check out our latest video on the bigs that are going to be hitting the trade market this year in the NBA.